Hello, welcome to Far More, Colorado. We're glad to be back with you, and my name is Barbara Paris. I'm a Colorado native and a jazz singer, and we're interviewing Mr. Billy Wallace, who has been a piano player since 1947, and to date he's still playing the piano. It's 2014. And we'd like to continue our interview with Billy Wallace. We left off in Chicago in the mid-'60s, so we're going to take a little road further from the mid-'60s and find out what else Mr. Wallace did to bring him thus far.
In 1965, I moved to Minneapolis and worked there. And then in 1966, I got a job at the Hilton in St. Paul. Had just opened as a hotel, and I got the job as the house band there. And I got some friends of mine who I'd played with from time to time, and we started as the house band. From 1966 to, I stayed there till 1969. No, 1971. I stayed there till 1971.
Well, that was a long residence.
And then I moved. I decided I wanted to live someplace else, so I moved to Denver.
So had you lived after you left Chicago, when you went back to Minneapolis, did you live in New York for a bit?
I lived in New York in 1951 when I was with Max Roach. And also I spent some time there. I was playing for a singer whose name is Johnny Janis. And he's a very fine singer, and I played for him in 1960. And his manager was also the manager of Tony Bennett. So I met Tony Bennett and his manager, and I even went to Tony Bennett's apartment in New York one time. And it was quite, we played at a place on the east side. I can't think of the name of the club. But all the famous singers would come there and listen to Johnny or come up and sit in and play. Tony Bennett was one of them. And I can't think of the names of the other singers.
Now, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the different styles of music that you played. You started playing boogie woogie, and maybe you can explain the style.
When Charlie Parker came on the scene, that kind of music kind of faded out of the jazz scene. There were a lot of people that liked it, but the only thing they liked about Charlie Parker was the way he played the blues. But other than that, but with the musicians, he was a genius. He was considered a genius, and probably still is. And
you told me once Charlie Parker could play everything in every key. He was just lucid. And
I don't know that. The person that I played with like that was his name. He was a saxophone player, tenor saxophone, Freeman, who I worked with quite a bit in Chicago.
And you also knew Frank Foster now.
Yes.
Frank Foster, he was leader of the
No,
Count
he
Basie.
was with Count Basie at the time.
Oh, he was with Count Basie.
And he had a reputation. He used to play alto saxophone, and because of Charlie Parker, he started playing tenor. And when the Basie band came to Chicago, they played somewhere, and there were different restaurants that the musicians would eat at late night. And Bill Lee and I saw Frank Foster and talked to him and told him about a session that we were having the next morning, Monday morning. And his eyes lit up. He was very interested, so he came and played with us. The whole job from 8 in the morning to about 1 in the afternoon.
So you ended up remaining, keeping a friendship with Frank Foster after that for many years.
Yes, till he died. We were very good friends.
So what are some of the other musicians that you met at those sessions in Chicago? You meet Frank Foster and Charlie Parker and Clifford Brown.
Those are the main ones. Vaughn Freeman, who was a native of Chicago, but he was right there with those people.
And did he ever leave Chicago?
No.
No, he didn't.
He died in Chicago.
When you left Chicago, you went to New York. Max Roach called you on the road, and you moved to New York then at that?
I didn't move there. I just was there.
Oh, you were?
Mm-hmm.
How'd you happen to leave Chicago and go to New York? And what year was that? You said
57.
So did you just get tired of Chicago, or did you move to New York for a reason?
I didn't move to New York. I was just there.
Oh, you were just playing there, touring there for a while.
Yeah.
So you were there working with Max Roach,
Yeah.
but you weren't really living there. You were still living in Chicago.
Yes.
How long were you in New York with Max Roach at that point?
Oh, about a month or so.
It was a nice experience being in New York. How was that music scene different from the Chicago music scene at the time?
Well, all the top musicians were in New York, so the music scene was probably more advanced. A lot of musicians seemed to think New York was like heaven. You know, there was no place. They used to tell me when I was in New York, they say when you go past the Hudson River, west, you go nowhere.
They would say that, maybe because they hadn't been there.
Well, everybody that lived in New York thought New York was the epitome of where to live.
So what kind of places did you visit in New York? You were on 42nd Street? Did you play?
I played there on 3 different occasions. One with Illinois Jacquet, one with Max Roach, and one with a singer named Johnny Janis, whose manager was also the manager of Tony Bennett. So he got a job at a little small club for singers on the east side, and I played there. I stayed there for about 2 months.
And you worked across the street from 42nd Street. There were jazz clubs.
Yes.
What was it?
42nd Street.
Yeah, there were jazz clubs up and down the streets. There were lots of jazz clubs, right?
Yes.
Do you remember the name of some of those jazz clubs? Well, we can look them up in a history book.
I can't remember now.
So all the musicians, it was just a very, very rich musical situation going on 42nd Street at the time.
So the people in New York thought.
They did?
Yeah.
But how did you feel about it coming from Chicago? Did you just...
Well, I didn't have the fascination for New York that the New Yorkers had. Because they would say, when you go past the Hudson River, you go nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, you weren't from New York. Many of those people that were saying that actual New York, they were New York residents. Were they from New York, or had they
I don't think anybody was from New York. Everybody was from someplace else. But they seem to think as New York as the Mecca of jazz. And I sort of felt that Chicago was. So
Well, you had a long stay in Chicago. Probably if you had, your experience is really colored by the experience that you have, and you had a really rich musical life in Chicago. So when you got to New York and you were there a month, you had been in Chicago for many years. So, and some people didn't know the whole Chicago scene as well as you did either, because you were in that. Like, whenever scene you're in, if musical situation, you get to know all the players and the way it works, so you have a better idea of the city. If people just went to Chicago and they had one nights there, they're not ever going to know the city in the same way as a person that is working that city.
that's probably the same for New York too, but
Yeah, probably. I mean, they're in New York and they know everybody. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows the clubs. And you were there a month. That it's not as long as being somewhere 10 years as you were in Chicago. And unfortunately, the people that toured out of New York, they were touring one night here, one night there, one night here, one night there. They were happy to find musicians like you and Bill Lee, that they would just hook them up to what was going on in the city, in Chicago when they got there, because they wanted to know what that musical scene was like, and they found it to be very rich when they were there too. I mean,
some of them.
Bill Lee is still alive. He's living in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
He's become quite an institution. And his son plays saxophone. I don't know how well he's doing now, but I know that he had started, and
I saw his son one night at Minton's. He sat in with the Sugar Hill Quartet. Young, but very good player. I wanted to ask you some things. Like, if you had to explain to someone the difference between boogie woogie and bebop, how would you describe those two different styles of music?
Boogie woogie is a lot simpler, and bebop involves a lot of harmonic advances and melodic advances. The melodies are much more complex, and the tempos are varying from very slow to very fast, and boogie woogie doesn't have that sort of flexibility.
And so, but boogie woogie, not everybody can play that, and that's a treasured style of music. So how would you describe the basis of that? Not all piano players can play boogie woogie, and not all bebop piano players can play boogie woogie, just like all bebop piano players can't play gospel music. So how would you...
Some people look at gospel music as the roots of jazz. I don't know if I do or not. Possibly because I don't know enough about gospel music. But
you know a lot about bebop. I mean, you know a lot about boogie woogie. So...
Well, I know who played it. And Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons, who was Gene Ammons' father, and
were those the primary boogie woogie people?
Mm-hmm.
And they were from, where were they from?
Chicago.
So what about that blues, the blues culture in Chicago? How was that blues culture? Was it because the boogie woogie came out of Chicago that blues culture developed in Chicago? Would you say?
It's hard to say. Albert Ammons, the father of Gene Ammons, was one of the top boogie woogie players. Meade Lux Lewis. The Those are the only two names that come to mind.
Now, when you learned boogie woogie and you got to Chicago, did you study? Did you follow those musicians to learn more about it, or?
No, when I got to Chicago, I couldn't work there because you had to be there for, I think, 6 months before you can work steady.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a wife and my oldest daughter, and so I had to have work. So I started working in Calumet City, where they had a series of strip clubs for strip dancers, and I started playing there for about...
Oh my gosh. Well, those...
For about 10 months I was there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you went on from New York to... Did you go back to Milwaukee after Chicago?
No.
You didn't?
From Chicago I moved to Minneapolis.
And you worked there until 71, you said?
Yes.
Okay, and then after that, what? After 71?
After that, I moved to Denver.
You did?
Yeah.
And so that was in the early 70s?
71, yes.
And how long did you stay in Denver at that stint?
Till I think 1991, I moved to Seattle.
So
and
how...
I stayed in Seattle from 91 to 2002 or 2003, and I moved to Las Vegas. And I was in Las Vegas till 2008. And I decided I didn't want to stay there any longer, so I came back to Milwaukee, came back to here.
To Denver.
To Denver because I like snow.
You like snow?
Yeah.
Like winter?
Yeah.
Now, when you were in Denver, during that period of time that you were in Denver, did Denver have a really, a pretty good jazz environment?
It was...
You worked steady. You've worked...
Yeah, I worked at the El Chapultepec with a tenor saxophone player who had been here quite a while. His name was Billy Tolles, and he's now passed, but he was one of the best-known saxophone players in jazz around Denver at that time. Since then, a lot of younger musicians have come along, but for a long time, Billy Tolles was the sort of top horn player in jazz in Denver.
Mm-hmm. And you worked in trios or all different settings, or?
Yeah, I worked in trios. The first place I worked was Lafitte, which was like the restaurant to be in. It was like the top restaurant in Denver at the time.
Was it on downtown on Larimer Square?
It was on 14th and Larimer.
14th and Larimer.
Downstairs in the basement.
Mm-hmm. And did you have a trio or a
Yeah,
quartet?
I had a trio. And
when did you also sing? Did you sing during that period of time in Denver?
No.
You didn't.
No.
When did you start singing, Billy?
When I was working at one of the hotels downtown. I can't think of the name of it. But I was there for a while.
And what prompted you to start singing?
One of the waitresses got me started for some reason. I don't know why I started, but I started then, and it took a while. And 1954. No, that was in the 80s. 1983, I got a chance to go to Japan by myself. And I went there and I played there for 3 months.
And did you sing at the time, play piano?
Yeah.
And you had a trio?
No, yeah, there was a trio. But they supplied the bass and drums.
Mm-hmm. And then you also went to, you once in late 80s, didn't you play at the White House?
Yes, I played with a friend of mine who was from Washington, and he had shined shoes on the steps of the White House, and he always vowed that one day he'd sing there, and he got the chance, and I went there with him, and we played at the White House.
What did he sing? Did you play a concert or a dinner, or was it a...
No, it was sort of informal. His daughter is a very fine singer also, so he and his daughter sang, and I just played.
So, Billy, there are so many musicians that you had the opportunity of working with. So many you have told me names of, and as you've had your entire career, you've been a musician from 1947 and even to date. And I'd like to know, have you enjoyed your life as a musician?
Yes, it's the only one I know.
So you became a musician not by choice, it just rather happened to you.
It happened, yeah.
But what would you give any advice to a younger musician that was starting up now, 16?
Learn music.
Understand how it works, right?
Yes. And learn songs. You have to know songs.
And how would you recommend that a young musician would learn this, how music works?
He just has to get in the woodshed and sit down and learn these songs. Get the real books, the music books, and learn these songs that are popular, you know, like Pennies from Heaven and Embraceable You and It Had to Be You, and a lot of the songs that Frank Sinatra did, a lot of the songs that Nat Cole recorded, a lot of the songs that have been Tony Bennett has recorded, and because you get requests for all of those.
Well, it's if you learn music, you want to learn the melody, so you have to understand the notes
and
in the song,
harmony
and the harmony, and but just reading music isn't enough. Just reading it, Billy plays piano, but he can play any song in any key, and he knows probably 5,000 tunes. So he understands how music works, where if you call a tune, he knows the melody by heart because he studied the music, grew up with the music. But this is the entire American songbook that you're talking about. There is so much music that came out of these eras, and this is part of our American culture now. This is the music. This belongs to our culture, came out of our country. So if you're going to be a musician, it's getting familiar with all of that music inside and out, not just
the American songbook.
The American songbook. And not nowadays we find that younger musicians, they start out with Coltrane. But in order to be jazz musicians, you'd recommend going back to the roots of jazz, you'd say, because you really started at the roots of jazz. Boogie woogie is pretty much the roots of jazz, or blues is the roots of jazz. Mm-hmm. And since you came up in all of that, just learning, sometimes I say we do 9 decades of jazz. You know about 9 decades of jazz, 1920s until right now, 2014. It's quite a few decades of jazz, so. Okay, Billy, well, it's been really nice having this conversation.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to learning how music works from you. And we want to thank you all for listening to and watching Far More Colorado. Thank you.